Principles of Economics, my complete guide to understanding economics, is now available in hardcover, audiobook, and ebook from Saifedean.com, Amazon, and many more booksellers worldwide. And now I am also teaching a course based on this book on my website, Saifedean.com. Principles of Economics will run the whole academic year, from September to June, and will have a new lecture every 2 weeks, as well as weekly live online discussion seminars open to learners from all over the world and from all walks of life. Whether you're a student, a professional, or a retiree, you are making economic decisions every day, and this course will arm you with the wisdom of centuries of economists to improve your economic decision-making. You'll also get a free book of Principles of Economics if you sign up for the course, and if you do it before September 20th, you'll get a 20% discount. Go to Saifedean.com and sign up now.
The Bitcoin Standard podcast is brought to you by Crowd Health. Crowd Health is the Bitcoiner's answer to fiat health insurance. If you listen to the show, you've probably heard me rail against the problems of modern healthcare and health insurance. Crowd Health is a brilliant new solution to this problem that leverages the power of Bitcoin to help people get affordable healthcare. Crowd Health holds its cash reserves in Bitcoin. It negotiates with healthcare providers on your behalf and gets you much better rates by offering to pay them cash, upfront, without having to go through the expensive bureaucracy of modern healthcare insurance. It's a solution that works better for healthcare providers and for patients by disintermediating large insurance companies who have the wrong incentives and are constantly raising costs. I'm very happy to have signed up for Crowd Health, and I'm really excited to support them as they disrupt the fiat health insurance industry. Go to joincrowdhealth.com and use the discount code SAIF, S-A-I-F, and you'll get the first 6 months for $99 only.
All right, the man, the myth, the legend. I'm so excited to have Saifedean Ammous back, obviously the author of the #1 book in the Bitcoin space, Fiat Standard. Then he wrote the Fiat Standard, and now he has a new book, The Principles of Economics. And this is a beast, the most comprehensive book I think you've written. Saifedean, thank you so much for coming back on the show.
Thank you for having me, Natalie. Always a pleasure to talk to you.
Well, I've shared so many times that you changed my life. Reading the Bitcoin Standard made me realize that I knew nothing about money and that everything I was taught in school was not exactly what I needed to know and understand about how the world works and how our financial system works. And so you sent me down the rabbit hole. And for that, I will be forever grateful. Now I've had the chance to read your latest book. So first of all, I want you to share with people. And by the way, I'm going to do a giveaway. So share this interview, whether you listen to it on audio or video, and I'm going to send someone the book and a couple of goodies because I think everyone needs to get it. So, Saif, why did you decide to write The Principles of Economics, which it wasn't lost on me that it's the same title as another book in the economic space? So what was the genesis of this?
Well, it's been 52 years since Carl Menger published his book. So I think he won't mind me taking the title from him. I think it's we're due for another book with that kind of title. And there are many other books actually that have that name. In fact, most university textbooks are called Principles of Economics. So I think it's just sort of the common name that is usually given for economics. And it makes sense because that's the name that you want to do. That's what you want to write. You want to write about the principles of economics. So that was really my motivation was to just write an economics textbook because it's something that I think the world really desperately badly needs. The vast majority of textbooks that exist today are basically mainstream Keynesian textbooks. They are what teaches you essentially government propaganda. And, the Bitcoin Standard, when I wrote it, a lot of people enjoyed it. A lot of people liked it. I got a lot of positive feedback from people telling me this is a great book. We really like the way that you write. We really like the way that you explain important concepts. And so for me, that motivated me to do something that I wanted to do for a very long time. I started teaching economics at university in 2009. So this is 14 years ago. And from day one, there was this problem of you have the Keynesian textbook, the mainstream textbook, which is, for me, completely unworkable. And then you don't really have a proper alternative that you could use that you could teach systematically. So I would have to resort to teaching different, different chapters from here and there, or different articles from here and there. You'd have to curate a syllabus, which gets a little bit confusing for students. And, you have to get to reading some old Austrian economists that write in a way that's not very approachable for most modern readers. And, the debates that they would get into in their books are debates with economists that are long dead and topics that are long irrelevant. So we needed an upgrade. We needed something that was modern, that was current, and that was approachable for the modern reader. And we needed it from the Austrian perspective. So the Bitcoin Standard and the Fiat Standard, I think the people liked them, but they were focused on the issue of money. And we didn't get to spend enough time, obviously, because it's not an economics textbook, don't get to spend enough time laying the groundwork and the foundations of the topic itself, which is what I'd always wanted to do. So I had ideas about a book like this since 2009, as I was saying. But then it was only after I wrote the Bitcoin Standard that I thought, well, now that I have a bunch of readers that like this way of writing, that like the crazy things that I want to talk about, I'm going to take advantage of this and I'm going to write a book for them. And so I started with this really a few months after the Bitcoin Standard was published. I started writing this, and it took a lot of time. During the time while I was writing it, I came up with the idea of the Fiat Standard. I started writing the Fiat Standard. I published the Fiat Standard, and I was still working on principles of economics throughout all of that. But I really enjoyed making it.
Well, you can tell it's a labor of love. You can tell how passionate you are about the subject. And I do appreciate how approachable you make it. You make it a lot more easy to understand, because I've tried to read a lot of the Austrian economists, and some of it, especially the works that were written so long ago, it does get a little bit dense. And you frame it in a way that anyone can understand, especially given the context of the present day. So let's go over some of the topics, because I know you called this a textbook, but I do think that the average person would benefit so much from understanding more about economics. We really have to have more financial literacy in every single country. And one of the biggest things that I learned from reading both your work as well as the work of those who inspired you is just this idea that money is emergent. It doesn't come from the government or centrally planned organizations. It is emergent in the market. So can you talk a little bit about the importance of that concept? And then from that, why you don't need an expanding amount of money. A fixed supply is actually better and can fulfill all the needs of society to be able to prosper.
Yeah, I think you've really hit straight at the main reason why the Austrians, I believe, are vilified, ostracized, and excommunicated from academia, because those two very important conclusions, which I think are very difficult to argue against. It's impossible to present any kind of coherent argument with a straight face and not be an idiot and believe it against those two propositions. It's very simple common sense when you think about it. But really, we have a very enormous and very extensive brainwashing apparatus that's out there all over the world to try and convince people that not even to try and convince people that these things are wrong, to try and just distract people from ever thinking about these questions, so that they continue to just believe the alibi, the cover story that is given, which is that money is a creation of the state. We can only have money if the state handles the money, and that the money supply needs to constantly grow to accommodate the growth of the economy. And I think the Austrians, it's a tradition that extends 150 years, and it's systematically shown this over and over and over again. And it stood the test of time. It's never been refuted. I don't think anybody has ever presented any kind of coherent argument that's against it. It's been ignored by government-paid economists because, they don't want to believe those things. But I believe it's very obvious that, you look historically, you see money is something that existed before all of the current governments in the world had existed. And it is something that will continue to exist after all of these governments collapse. So we know that gold has been used as money for many decades and centuries, for many millennia, actually. And, all the governments that we have today, they were not around when gold was money. And thousands of states and governments have come along, used gold as money, and have gone away, and gold continued to be money. So it isn't the state that makes money. Money emerges on the market, and it emerges on the market for the same reason that all kinds of other goods emerge on the market. People want to eat, and so then there's an industry that develops around food. You don't need the state to tell people, hey, you should eat, and if you don't eat, you'll starve. And therefore, because we are good, we're going to develop an industry called the food industry so that we can make food so that we can feed you. No, humans eat, humans produce food, and then humans start trading the food, and then a food industry emerges out of that. And it's the same with money. It's just another economic good. And Carl Menger, I think, he explains the emergence of money. He explains how it's just another economic good. Mises is also, in his work, he showed how money emerges on the market and how it can emerge on the market without needing the mandate of a state, without needing the fiat of a state in order to decide what money is. And when you look at what has emerged as money historically, you see, and I discussed this in the Bitcoin Standard as well, historically, whatever emerges as money is usually whatever is the hardest to make. At any point in time, it's just people will choose that thing either consciously because they think this is a good thing. We need to have a hard money, or even if they don't choose it unconsciously, even if they don't choose it consciously, it emerges on its own on the market just because the things that hold on to their value best over time are the things that are hard to make. So historically, we see this, and we see that this is a process that takes place on the market without the need for government edict. And in fact, we see it's the other way around. If you have a government and you want your government to be taken seriously by people, you need to look at what people are using as money and use that as money. And that's how money comes on. That's how state money comes into existence. The state uses the money of the market. The state doesn't impose money on the market. And when the state tries to impose money on the market, we see enormously disastrous consequences, as in many places in the 20th century. And then the second question is the supply of money. I think this is really the most fun way to break the brain of your local Keynesian. Just ask them, why do we need more money? Why should the money supply grow? And the mental gymnastics are always hilarious. No, we need more money because we have more people. Well, why can't the value of the money just go up? No. There's all these reasons, but in reality, the thing that distinguishes money from all other goods is that the quantity of money does not matter. What matters about it is its supply. Its purchasing power. So the total supply of money doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if you live in an economy with 100 billion units of your currency, or 1 billion, or 1 trillion, or 50,000, whatever number it is. You can run a functioning economy on any number of currency units as long as they're divisible. And we see this all over the world. What's the correct supply of money for a country? How many units of your currency per capita should you have? And there is no correct answer. So in Japan, it's one thing. In the US, it's another thing. In Brazil, it's another thing. All countries have different money supplies and different populations. And there's no magic formula that says, you need to have $5 per capita or $5,000 per capita in order for the economy to work. Obviously, it's completely nonsensical. What matters about money, and this is where it's distinct from all capital goods and consumer goods. Money is a good that's unique in this respect, in that consumer goods, the more you have of it, obviously, the more utility you get from it. And capital goods, the more you have of it, the more consumer goods you can make out of it. But money, on the other hand, the only thing you use it for is to exchange it for other goods. And so therefore, it doesn't matter for you how much what the quantity is. What matters for you is the purchasing power. That's why you'd rather have $10 than 100 Japanese yen, because 100 Japanese yen, even though it's more, it's a bigger number, it's not as valuable as $10. So people would rather take the smaller number of dollars over the larger number of yens, because the smaller number has a higher purchasing power. Only Keynesians care about the number. Only Keynesians might choose more yens because they think, oh, well, that's a higher number, so that's going to make me richer. But, for everybody who has a functioning brain, no, what you care about is how much you can get for it. So you look at the things that you want to buy. You see that the sandwich you want to buy, the can of Coke that you want to buy, you see what it's priced in dollars and yens. And you can realize then that you care more about the purchasing power. And so you'd rather take the smaller quantity. And so because of that, money is unique in that any supply of money is enough for any economy, as long as it's continuously divisible. And as long as you can keep dividing into smaller units, then as more people use it and as more economic production takes place, the value of the money increases and the value of each unit of the money increases. And then the people who are using it are able to get all the services that money renders without the supply needing to increase.
It's such an important concept to grasp because you're absolutely right. It doesn't matter if you have $1 million in your bank account. It matters what the million will buy you. And if you have hyperinflation, you could have $1 billion in your account or whatever the currency is, and yet it might not buy you a loaf of bread. And yet we focus on sort of the wrong things in the economy, and we have someone or a small group of people actively managing the cost of capital and manipulating everything. I saw a video on Twitter that parts of your book reminded me of where, if more money solved the problem of poverty, then we could just print our way out of anything. Why do we even have homeless people? Why do we have the poor if we have a money printer? And it's obviously because the more that you distort those numbers and add to the supply of money, that doesn't create real value. That doesn't create actual real goods. We need more consumer goods, more capital goods, which we haven't really been investing in. We've had malinvestment. And that's sort of the idea of the business cycle. So I was hoping you could kind of break that down, because we're seeing that the bad side of the business cycle start to play out. And we still have so much liquidity in the system that I think it's still going to take time. We can kick the can down the road, but we're heading toward a cliff, right? Because we stimulated the economy. We artificially lowered interest rates, as we always do. We manipulated the cost of capital. Money poured into places. And now the tide is coming out and we're seeing who's swimming naked. So can you talk about the business cycle and why that's so important for the average person to understand?
Yeah. So what I do in this book is that because I have my own readership and I don't need to try and appeal to the universities. I'm not trying to get published in university presses, and I'm not trying to impress committees of academics. I'm writing for readers. I'm writing for people who want to read and who want to learn. And it's extremely liberating. And like when I first decided to start writing the Bitcoin Standard, this was, I'd been a professor for 9 years, and I was struggling all the time with trying to publish anything, because anything I would write, I would had such a hard time getting into academic journals, because academic journals is, to put it politely, run by complete morons. And, the only way to get published is to write complete nonsense. You have to write idiotic nonsense. And that's not the difficult part. The difficult part is you have to actually believe the complete nonsense in order to be able to write it, because it's such a tedious and time-consuming process to try to get into it. You can't just lie to them and get in. So writing for academics means that you have to constantly you have to constantly take as your starting point their accepted premises. You have to buy their premise and then begin from that and then try and argue about it. And of course, when you're young and when you think that academia is this place where, brilliant minds go to fight about ideas, you have this idealism that, I'm going to explain to them why this thing is wrong. And then you realize, no, you're dealing with a bunch of paper pushers who are not out there to arrive at any kind of truth. They're out there to just, do their jobs. And the job is to jump through the hoops so that you can get the paper through, and then you get published, and then you get promoted, and you keep running on that treadmill of academic publication, which makes most people in that system completely miserable, because deep down inside that you're not producing anything of value. You're writing papers that nobody reads. They contribute nothing to the world, and they just serve to keep your miserable job, which is it's not like you're going to feel rewarded or satisfied when you keep the job, because you don't get the feeling that you're actually producing anything of value that makes that job worthwhile. So a little bit of a long intro to lead to the point where that I decided to write this book purely from an Austrian perspective. And I didn't want to spend my time trying to argue with the prevalent mainstream perspective. And this was enormously liberating. And I believe it's enormously valuable for the reader, because we have, from the Austrian perspective, we have a very coherent story that explains how this business cycle works, how money works. And if you just go through it from the Austrian perspective, it all flows logically, and you build one chapter after another, and you arrive at a conclusion that I think is very, very valuable and very educational. Whereas even in the majority of Austrian textbooks, like if you read Rothbard, you'll see that there's an enormous amount of the framing of the story that is all about trying to argue with the mainstream economists. And this is kind of understandable, because back when he was writing, there was no internet. There were no, there were no Bitcoin maximalists out there buying his books. So he had to try and appeal to the academics. He was still trying to argue with the Keynesians. He was still trying to tell them, no, you're wrong. That's not how it works. It works this way. And I think this is enormously, it's an enormous burden that makes, say, Man, Economy and State, which I see on your shelf behind you, it makes it a very difficult book to read because there's so many pages that are just fighting with completely inconsequential Keynesians that are completely forgotten. Nobody remembers who those people are anymore because, again, they were the paper pushers of the time who were just repeating the whatever the central banks wanted to hear so that they could get funding. And trying to frame your explanation of the business cycle in terms that that you can use to try and argue with those people is going to undermine your ability to explain. So that's why, for me, and a big part of this book, a big part of the time that it took to write this book was trying to figure out how to structure things and how to structure the chapters one after another to arrive at the explanations that I wanted to do. And so for me, I start off with the analysis of money, which I discuss in the book in chapters 11, I think, or maybe 10.
10.
Chapter 10 or 11. I go over money, what money is, explaining the function of money, and then the point that you asked me about in the first question on why money supply is fixed. And then from that, I move toward the concept of time preference. And I believe this is really a foundational concept in Austrian economics, and also foundational concept for explaining the business cycle. And again, freed from the shackles of having to frame it in Keynesian terms or try and debunk the Keynesian perspective. Start off with what money is, and then explain how money is related to time preference. And that, when we have money that is hard, we're able to save for the future. And so we're able to accumulate wealth for the future and accumulate capital for the future in the form of money. And that gives us more of an ability to provide for our future. So therefore, it lowers our time preferences. So I argue that hard money is an enormously pivotal technology for the lowering of time preference. In fact, I even go as far as saying it's like a control knob for our time preference. And if you look around, you look at societies where people are witnessing hyperinflation, nobody has the ability to think of the future. And so people's time preference is very high. People are barely able to think about how they survive the next week, the next month, the next few days. So long-term planning goes out the window. On the other hand, the harder our money gets, the more we're able to plan for the future, the more we can provide for the future, the more capital we put aside. The more resources we put aside from consumption, we delay consumption, and then we put resources aside, and then we're able to invest. So that's the starting point for the analysis of the business cycle. And then once you understand it this way, then you see why investment is very important. If we have a good money, and of course we don't need money to invest, we can invest even in a primitive economy that doesn't have money, even in one person on an island, you can invest. You can delay gratification. Instead of eating the corn, you plant the corn. Instead of keep trying to catch fish with your hands all day, you spend some time building a spear, and then you start catching fish with that spear. That's capital, that's investment. And the time that you took away from catching fish means that you're catching fewer fish today, but that gives you spear, which then results in higher productivity tomorrow. That's the investment. You gave up a few fish today so that you'd have more fish tomorrow and the days after, because you have the spear and you have the equipment that you need. So when we lower our time preference, we are able to think of the future, and then we're able to dedicate our resources toward the creation of capital goods, which we then use to increase our productivity, and we use to make more and more production. And so that's how things go nicely. This is it's chapter 13 explains time preference, and then chapter 14 explains how capital markets work, and in what Ludwig von Mises calls commodity credit. In other words, this is when everything is sane and the world is not crazy, and the Keynesians haven't been ruining everything yet. So people take effectively the commodity that is money, and they don't spend it, and they hold on to it, and they use it to provide credit for other people. So I take the money that I have and I give it to you, and then you, as a capitalist, you take that money. As an entrepreneur, you take that money and you use it in production. So as long as we are involved in the process of production, and as long as the process of production involves the sacrifice of present resources, someone somewhere is taking away commodity money and not consuming it and giving it to an entrepreneur who's then utilizing it for the process of production, then we're good. The resources are dedicated towards the process of production. And I mean, it's almost basic physics. There's a set amount of resources that exist at a certain society at a certain point in time. And if you eat all of the corn, you can't plant any corn. You have to, forego consuming some of your corn in order to be able to plant some of it so that you could have some corn tomorrow. If you eat all of the seed corn, it's gone. Right. So this is how things go nice. Chapter 14 is commodity credit. Somebody makes a sacrifice, and the only way that you can do that is that you lower your time preference. So you lower your time preference, you decide, you know what, I'm going to cut down on the corn today so that I can have more corn tomorrow. And you make the sacrifice, and then these resources go into production, and then we get more output next year. And it's true at the scale of one farmer growing corn on his own farm. And it's also true at the scale of society. It doesn't change when you have a big society. It's the same thing. There's labor and capital and highly advanced machinery and all those things. There's a set amount of that stuff. And you have to forego consumption. Every single bit of capital in the world is foregone consumption. I mean, you look at the largest factories in the world, you look at the biggest ships in the world, you look at the most sophisticated machinery and capital equipment in the world, it's owned by somebody who's using it for production. And that person is foregoing consumption today. Every person who owns a capital good, and it could be a physical capital good, or it could be stocks in a company, it could be an investment or a private equity or venture capital, whatever it is. If you're an investor, you are foregoing consumption. At any point in time, you can liquidate your investment and throw an amazing party with it. Everybody who owns a giant boat could decide to sell that boat on that day and throw the most amazing party. You could consume more in the next year than you would consume for the rest of your life, perhaps, if you just sold all the capital you have and then threw parties with it. So at any point in time, capital can only exist by foregoing consumption, by lowering time preference. And that's how it works in chapter 14. Then in chapter 15, we discover, Keynesians, or Keynesians discover us, more accurately. Keynesian parasites find humanity, find productive human beings, and they figure out how to ruin everything. And the way that they ruin everything is that they try and sell you the idea that you can have a free lunch. You can have, you can plant corn while also eating all the corn that you have.
Right,
you don't have to give up on corn. That's really what it is. And that's what Mises calls circulation credit. And, the corn example is a simplified example to try and make it intuitive. But in a modern capitalist system, because it's far more sophisticated, right, the way that we are sold this scam is through the way in which the modern monetary and banking system works, which is that, hey, you know what, we can just give you credit, and we don't need to have anybody make savings for that credit. So that's what Mises calls circulation credit, which is nobody is putting aside resources. There's no sacrifice in order for those resources to be brought into production. And the idea is, we could just, print physical pieces of paper or issue credit or create what Mises calls fiduciary media, which is basically money that comes without a concomitant delay in gratification. And then we can have our cake and eat it, or we can have our seed corn and eat it. So you can eat the seed corn, and then we just issue papers for new corn. And then we use those papers to buy other corn, and then we put it under the ground, and then we grow corn, and we'll have corn next year. And that's really ultimately, I think, the kind of overarching explanation of the Austrian business cycle theory, in that you can either have circulation, you can either have commodity credit, in which case you grow the corn, and then the growing of the corn can succeed or can fail. You can get more corn next year, but it could also go bad. You may get a locust infestation, or something might kill your crop. So there's always success and failure in entrepreneurship, but there is a chance that you might produce more because you have set aside actual seed corn and you planted it. Mm-hmm. And if all goes well, you'll get more output from this process. But the other situation is when we try and have the free lunch, when we try and have something for nothing. And here we say, we can just eat all the corn, and then we'll do financial wizardry, and that'll allow us to get more corn somehow next year. And that, of course, has never worked out. I mean, it's almost like the Roadrunner and Wile E. Coyote cartoon, where every single time Wile E. Coyote thinks, no, now I've got it, and then it's just a matter of finding out in which way it's going to blow up. Is the anvil going to hit the Wile E. Coyote on the head, or is he going to fall off a cliff, or is he going to shoot himself in the face? There's always going to be some way in which this is going to blow up, because you can't have something for nothing. And so this is kind of the Austrian story, and of course it's a lot more complicated than I can explain it here, but that's, I would say, the overall explanation for it, that ultimately it comes down to the idea that you can have something without nothing. And that's basically the fundamental premise of fiat economics, which is we don't need to make sacrifices. We don't need to save. We can just have the money printer finance everything that we want and give us all the seed corn that we want. We can just print seed corn.
No, it's such a powerful analogy, the seed and the seed corn. You're right. Nothing is being put away. No consumption is being deferred. There's no savings from which you are borrowing. You're just making it up out of thin air. And that's what they keep doing. They're going to print money. Right now, they're trying to, remove some of the money out of the system. But in the end, because we're so bloated with credit, we have to print eventually. And there's really no way out of that system, right? And so that's why so many people have found that Bitcoin's, life raft, because it can be this parallel system that we peacefully opt into, although so many people still don't understand it. And one thing that I think is really interesting that the Austrians, touch on so much is this idea that capitalism actually leads to more abundance and prosperity. And because you're actually focusing on yourself, you're serving others. By trying to gain a profit, you're doing so by trying to serve the customers and serve the people in your community. I pulled one of your quotes. It says that the capitalistic market system makes people specialize in what they do best and focus on how to provide value to others rather than focusing on what they value themselves. And I remember, I think you might have said this on Twitter or somewhere, that that's also the root of happiness, is when you're serving a purpose outside of yourself. It's not just for pleasure, but it's actually to provide value for others. So can you touch on that? Because in today's world, we see capitalism, especially in mainstream media, as bad, greedy, bad. That's what's led to a lot of the wealth inequality. But when you actually study capitalism from the Austrian economic theory, it's actually what causes so much good and opportunity in the world, it seems.
Absolutely. No, I agree. I think the thing that people miss is that under a capitalist system, obviously the term is completely butchered today, and people think of capitalism as just being bad. But really what it means is that you're part of a social order, an extended order of production, in which strangers have to cooperate, in which people who don't know each other trade with one another and essentially build this production structure together. So think about, the things that you buy and the things that you consume on any given day. Think about just, looking at you right now, think about all the things that you have in your, just in the screen behind you, all the books behind you, that block clock that you have, the beautiful flowers behind you. You didn't build any of that stuff, as far as I know. I don't think you grew the flowers. You didn't print the books. You didn't write the books. Millions of people all over the world had to collaborate together to write those books, to print those books, to distribute them, to ship them, to put them on trucks, to deliver them to the bookshop from which you bought them. And none of those people, the vast majority of those people don't know each other. And yet this process takes place, not because all of those people wake up every morning and think, how do we serve Natalie? That's not really the motivation. Every one of those people is out there trying to look out for himself. The people writing the books, growing the flowers, all of those things are being produced by people that are trying to do the best for themselves. And the reason you choose to go out there and engage in the production of something so sophisticated that then ends up in Natalie's office is because it's enormously more productive than trying to produce everything for yourself. That's really the key thing. And that's ultimately what is the driver for human civilization, I argue in this book, in that we can, a lot of people think, well, capitalism is just, it's a quaint idea. It's silly. Society is about the strong. Humanity is always a place where the strong takes what the weak has, and conflict is eternal. And that's idiotic nonsense, because no, the strongest monster, the strongest animal, the strongest human is completely powerless compared to any human being who's able to tap into the real human superpower that we have, which is capitalist civilization. So the strongest man alive, the most vicious fighter who would have no problem with killing 100 people with his bare hands, is completely powerless next to a 10-year-old girl that has access to a gun because she's part of the division of labor. She has one tiny little gun. She pulls the trigger. She shoots him. He's dead. So the superpower that we have as humanity is our ability to collaborate and cooperate and be part of this capitalist civilization, which allows us to produce output that is infinitely more valuable and infinitely more useful to us than anything that we could do on our own. So no person on their own could ever have the kind of quality of life that they would have if they are part of this global division of labor. They're part of the capitalist system where everybody accumulates capital, everybody trades, everybody specializes, and that increases our productivity enormously. And so the only way to be part of that is to deal with others in a civilized manner. So you respect others, you respect their property, you respect their right to own property, and you respect their right to only trade with you according to their acceptance of the terms, mutual acceptance of terms. So free exchange that is mutually beneficial to both. If you're able to accept that, if you're able to tame that animal inside you that just wants to take other people's stuff and do whatever animalistic urges you get. Yeah. If you're able to tame that, you become a civilized human being because you're able to cooperate with others. And in that kind of setting, everything that you want is on the other side of serving others. Everything that you want, whatever it is that you want, you can try and do it on your own. You can try and build it on your own. You can try and steal it. You can try and murder others to take their stuff. You're not going to get anywhere near getting what you want in that, using that method, compared to what you could get if you just trade with people like a civilized human being. And so the smartest way for you to secure the things that you want is for you to cooperate with others, and for you to wake up every morning and think about, how do I give other people things that are valuable for them? Because in a capitalist economy, what is most valuable for you is not the thing that you should be working on. The things that I want in life are not the things that I spend all my day working on. Yeah, I have a few copies of my book, as you can see behind me, but I spend my time writing those books, not so that I could have those copies. I spend my time so that I could sell them, so that people can buy them. And then from the money that I make from selling those books, I buy the things that I want. And so the more that I'm able to serve people by giving them things that they want, the more I am able to get the things that I want. And that's really the driver for people to be civilized. That's the driver for people to be part of human society. And, after in the book, I can't summarize the whole book, but if you've read it, I'm sure you've seen, how I explain how the capitalist system develops and how it comes about, and then why the capitalist system relies on human beings accepting the system of property rights, accepting the system of capitalism, accepting the idea that other people need to have their own property, and that if we don't accept those things, then we can't have nice things. And I think the dangerous thing about what is happening in the world right now, there's that strong bias that we want to think that today is always better than yesterday, and things keep getting better. And in a sense, they are. Technologically, we're constantly improving. Today's computers are faster than last year's computer. The cars are getting better. Well, the airplanes is a complicated one. Maybe they're not. But I think there is a significant case to be made that things are getting worse, in the sense that the capitalist civilization is breaking apart because the money is broken, because the money is the glue that holds this entire system together. It's the critical component that allows for that cooperation to happen, because none of this division of labor, none of this cooperation between us as individuals would be possible if we didn't have money. I would not be able to trade. I'd not be able to specialize in something as arcane as writing books about economics and shipping them all over the world to people if we could not trade in money. If we had to trade directly, if I had to write books and then find somebody who grows cows so that he could give me beef in exchange for my books, it's not going to work. I'd have to just go back to a system wherein I need to grow my own cows. And a lot of people romanticize this. I think also among Bitcoiners, we see a lot of this kind of, when Bitcoin goes to the moon, I'm just going to start growing my own food and I'm going to get off the grid. And I think, you have to be extremely rich to be able to afford to live this kind of simplistic fantasy of I'm just going to live off the land on my own, because you can't do it on your own. And the quality of life that you'd have on your own, if you try to live truly on your own, is you probably wouldn't make it. The vast majority of us wouldn't make it for a year if we truly tried to live off the land. Sure. What we do is, if we do become extremely rich, we would be able to buy a lot of equipment and a lot of machines from this global division of labor. We'll buy engines and we'll buy farming equipment and we'll buy all of those things from the division of labor, and then we'll be able to live in a world where we grow our own food. So we essentially we're letting global capitalism do 99% of the job, and then we're turning up at the finish line and taking all the credit and saying, I grew my own food and I'm self-reliant and I'm independent. But you're not. You go out into the jungle and spend a year and see how far you get on your own if you really want to be independent. So I think it's the really dangerous thing about the world we're living in is that the breakdown of money, because of this massive dysfunction of the fiat monetary system, is threatening the fabric of human civilization, because it's making cooperation between human beings harder, it's making trade between human beings harder, and it's destroying our ability to save, and it's destroying our ability to provide for the future. But I think just to kind of spoil the ending of the book, I think it's humans have always faced threats, and as I was mentioning earlier, brutish people will always think, well, let me just attack the people who have nice things and I'll take their nice things. But we've always found ways around that. We've always found ways to tame animals, to tame violent human beings, because when we cooperate, when we use our reason and cooperate together, we develop massively more productive technologies. And so I think, just like we've conquered nature in many ways, we've conquered animals, and we've conquered barbarian human beings who don't believe in those things, I believe we'll conquer the current brand of barbarians that threaten us, which is essentially central banking. And I believe the way that we will conquer it is through the inventions of reason, which is Bitcoin.
I completely agree with you that the capitalistic system is breaking down. Our money is broken, and we're seeing it manifest in society in an erosion of morality and values. And that's why so many parts of your book were so thought-provoking for me, this idea that you actually create civilization when you're able to drop your time preference and plan for the future and save, and in order to create these capital goods and then consumer goods that you can use over the long term. And we don't have that anymore. We're living paycheck to paycheck. You talk about in your book this idea that you can rationalize maybe more reckless behavior because you just feel like you can't catch up and you can't get by. So do you actually, when we look at society today, sort of the civil fights that are going on, everyone teaming into, I'm on the red side versus the blue side, everything is political, populism is increasing. It seems like that's what happens at the end of empires or debt cycles. Is this how you see this playing out? And do you see Bitcoin as the way that we can fix this?
Absolutely. I think so. I think, if you people like to think that hyperinflation is something different from inflation. So if you read the Keynesian textbook, they'll tell you, inflation is a good thing, deflation is bad, hyperinflation is bad. You just need the right amount of inflation at the right dose. And I don't think that is the case. I think regular fiat inflation, which you experience in even the best kind of run monetary systems like in the US and Europe and these countries, that's just slow motion hyperinflation. And so all the things that you'd see in places like Lebanon or Zimbabwe or Venezuela, they are playing out at a slower pace in countries where the money is inflating at a lower pace. It's a very similar situation. And as I was saying earlier, in those places where you have hyperinflation, if you have no way of providing for yourself in 5 years from now, your ability to think about what you want to be doing 5 years from now is massively compromised. Your ability to think about where am I going to be in 10 years from now is massively compromised. So that reflects on all of your decisions today. And I think this is really, really a very important thing. Yeah. And you see it in yourself. And I think, Bitcoiners, countless number of Bitcoiners have shared this story with me, the difference between their life before they got on Bitcoin and after they got on Bitcoin, in the sense of how much of your life is focused on the present versus the future, and the short term versus the long term. Without the ability to think of the long term, without the ability to save and provide for the long term is naturally discounted. And so when in all of your actions, you discount the future more heavily and you think of the present a lot more. So when you discount the future more heavily, it reflects in all manners of decisions. And I think, one of those things is your civility, your ability to deal with others. So in a society in which your money is collapsing, it seems like a nice idea to be, it might be nice to be civil everywhere, but the payoff on being civil is highly uncertain. And the payoff on not being civil is a lot more valuable in that world, because, if I steal something from you, or if I aggress against you, or if I betray you, say you trust me with something and you let me handle something for you, and then I want to make a payment on your behalf. And if I just go and tell you and take that money, or if I steal things from you, or if I'm, let's say, a friend of yours and I go into your house and I steal stuff from you, these kind of things, if I lived in a world in which I was thinking about the long term, I'm less likely to do that, because, well, what if you find out? Well, if you find out, then I'm never going to be able to be your friend forever. I've lost a friend forever. I've lost a business partner forever, or I've lost an employee or an employer forever. Whereas if I have no idea what's going to be happening in a year or 5 years or 10 years, because everything is up in the air because of hyperinflation or high inflation, well, then the payoff becomes more valuable, because, I'm starving today. I'm very hungry. I don't have any money. And if I steal something from you, you're my boss, and I steal something from the job, then I will secure myself for next week. And, if you find out, it sucks, but it's in the future. So 3 years from now, I might not be able to deal with you. I might not be able to get a job with you. It's going to suck. But hey, 3 years from now, I might not even make it. Right. So this kind of short-termist behavior, uncivilized behavior, lack of morality, and just prioritizing the present, I think it's something that has a lot to do with the destruction of money and with the destruction of civilization. And I think it's something you see in hyperinflation, you see in high inflation, and I think you see it all over the world. And a lot of the world today is essentially normalizing this. Like, I think, if you walk around in an American city, it's astonishing. It's a jungle. The stories you hear about places like San Francisco or LA, and I've been to some of these places and I've seen, it's absolutely amazing that people think of those places as cities when really they're not cities, they're jungles. It's completely lawless. There is no sense of community, no sense of society. Kids can't walk the street in American cities. I think this is really a very shocking thing that most people just seem to take for granted. And there's, I lived in New York for a while, and I know this is kind of the way in which people try and normalize things is they joke about them. And so New Yorkers are always like to joke about, people doing disgusting things in the subway, and people doing nasty things in the streets and people shouting and people behaving in an uncivilized way. And they joke about it being only in New York. And this is the charm of Manhattan and the charm of New York. It's not charming. It's your society falling apart and degenerating and going back to the jungle. And it's, I think, inextricably linked to the fact that we don't have a functioning monetary system that allows people to cooperate and collaborate and save and think of the future. And it's, people don't like to think of it. People like to rationalize it and ignore it. They think it's just, this is what it is to be part of a vibrant metropolis. It's just a lot of people. And no, it's not. We've had vibrant cities before. We've had big cities before. And they used to be safe, and they used to be a lot cleaner. New York used to be a lot safer back in the day than it is now. And it's I think you're absolutely correct on the politics as well. In a world in which the politics, when everybody gets to, when nobody gets to save because the money's constantly getting destroyed, well, who's destroying that money? That money's being destroyed by the government. So basically being in charge of that government gets you to be in charge of everybody's money. You can take everybody's wealth if you're in charge of that government. And so people are going to fight very, very, very strongly for that. And I think this is why you see, in civilized societies, people are able to settle their differences in a civilized, peaceful way. People can seek mediation. People can discuss things where we have a difference and then things don't go my way, but they go your way. I can still get out of bed the next morning and work and collaborate with you. We can have different teams and we can still be, still part of the same society, still believe that we belong there. But when the jackpot, when the prize for politics is control of all of society's money, it's not going to be a friendly fight. It's not going to be a friendly competition. It's going to be a competition to the death. And I think if you look at American politics, I don't follow closely, but you look at the way that things are going, we're getting it to the point where it's becoming extremely ugly. It's getting to the point where, I think one interesting thing that's happening over the last few months is with the prosecution of Trump, where we're getting into the point where this is, banana republic territory, wherein the first thing you do when you get into office is you prosecute your political opponents. And then that means that when your political opponents get into office, the first thing that they are going to do is prosecute you. And so therefore, the stakes become extremely, extremely, extremely high, because you're either going to be in power, in charge of everything and able to command everybody's money, or you're going to be in prison, or you're going to be killed, or you're going to be assassinated. And this is, I think, that this is just another one of those symptoms of the breakdown of civilized capitalist society.
It's so crazy, Saif, because I feel like before we used to uplift the importance of the intellect. It was on a pedestal that you could control your will. You didn't give in to these base impulses and the short-term thinking, and you were able to rise above some of these animalistic instincts that are in all humans, and you formed society, and you were able to, plan for the future. And you talk about that in your book. And today, the opposite behavior is rewarded. Like the girl that goes on OnlyFans and shows her body will make, hundreds of thousands of dollars and is now looked at as, I want to be like her by some young people, as opposed to the person that goes and gets the, medical degree and becomes a surgeon to actually contribute positively. And everything is like backwards and sideways. And, I think some people blame it just on technology, social media. That's what's torn us apart. But if you dig deeper, it's actually because of the money and the incentives in the system. Would you agree?
I agree. I think, people have always been blaming technology. I think there was somebody posted something about, I think it was Aristotle, who was saying, kids these days, they can't think because they can't talk and think properly because they're reading and writing instead of thinking. So, reading and writing was blamed. Every generation is always looking at new technology and they focus on the bad aspects of it. And of course, technology today allows us to do bad things that we couldn't do previously, but it also allows us to do a lot of good things that we couldn't do previously. And I think the factor that determines whether people go to the good thing or the bad thing is more than the technology itself. I think it's just, I believe really it's the time preference, and I think the hardness of money is like the control knob for all of those things. So we were mentioning politics is one aspect of it, civilization and morality, and people being able to deal with each other in a civilized way and thinking of the long term is another part of it. But also, the examples that you mentioned, people don't have much of an incentive to do the sacrifices that are necessary for investing in, maintaining their relationships with other people for the long term. And that applies to the example that you mentioned, where it's, you can go on OnlyFans and make a lot of money today, and, you'll be happy with it. But then 10, 20 years from now, you pay the price. And it's what's so insidious about it is that this forces us towards it doesn't force us, but it makes it far more likely that people go toward the short-term based decisions rather than the long-term based decisions, because the future becomes more and more uncertain. So you see people invest less in family, people invest less in maintaining civilized relations with others. You see real connections, and you see, people delay starting a family because there's the long-term payoff is uncertain. And of course, the flip side of this, which I discussed in the Fiat Standard, is that what government money allows is essentially the replacement of the role of the family. Without government money, family was your only way of providing for yourself in the long term. You needed children to be around you in the long term. Well, the idea that, no, government has money and government can provide us welfare means that, why should I? Why should I sacrifice my youth for one person when I could enjoy it, and then, everybody else will just have to chip in with their tax money to support me when I'm older? I think this can't be discounted as a part of the reason for the delay in starting a family, the fact that families are much smaller, the fact that people are less invested in making families. And it's sad to put it this way, but this is how societies die. I mean, if you're not breeding, your society is not going to be there in the future.
Right. Well, and we have a lot of those problems right now, especially given the entitlements, and everything is so top heavy when it comes to how we've structured our government debt. And, it's interesting to see that the narratives are so blatantly out there now. It's like, these are our children, the state's children. They're not even your children. If you're a parent, you can't even make decisions about your kids today. I mean, it's really crazy. Before we start to wrap up, I wanted to ask you, there are hundreds of years of knowledge that we have to build upon in terms of how to structure a government or a society. If Keynesianism doesn't work, which it clearly, you and I both agree it doesn't, why do we keep going in this direction? I mean, why haven't we had a shift? Maybe Bitcoin will provide something like that, but why do we keep going in that direction? We have so many examples of failed experiments of socialism, Marxism, and generally centrally planned governments that manipulate money.
It's because we haven't had Bitcoin yet. That's what it comes down to. It's ultimately, honestly, I think it's in a sense technological, in that technology over the past 500 years has evolved to the point where human society has become so much more, so much larger. The scope of the people that you trade with has grown enormously. So 500 years ago, my ancestors, your ancestors, your ancestors probably in Poland, my ancestors in Palestine, had absolutely nothing to do with each other. There was very little trade going on between them. And now here we are, you and I, basically, you buy my book and I get on your show and we're exchanging things with one another. So the world's becoming far more intertwined. Over the last 500 years, I think, with the invention of hydrocarbon technologies, cars, trains, airplanes, ships, all of these things led to the movement of trade extremely quickly. But, so our goods and our economic value started traveling very quickly. But our money couldn't keep up. Our money was still yellow rocks, and it couldn't keep up. And so in order for us to try and make it keep up, and this is basically the thesis of the Fiat Standard, in order for us to try and make it keep up, we had to centralize it and then start moving credit liabilities for it instead of moving it around, so that we, the central banks settle with one another every couple of years or every couple of months or every couple of weeks or whatever it is. And that saves us from having to move the stuff around. So then that just put centralized power in the hands of central banks. And that in the 19th century was an enormously lucrative jackpot out there for people, for essentially the worst people of every society in the world to catch, to take over. So if you're a good person, you think, I want to make tables, I want to make shoes, I want to be a doctor, I want to do this, I want to do that. But if you're a bad person, you think, wow, look, that giant pot of gold right in the biggest bank, the central bank of the country. And if I get my hands on that big giant pot of gold, I don't need to make shoes or anything useful for the rest of society. I can just continue to take advantage of everybody else working hard while I just print money. So I think it's technological in that sense, and I think it's just the nature of progress. It's uneven. We're constantly progressing in certain ways and we're regressing in other ways, and technology is always enforcing its reality on the world. So our ability to trade with one another is improved. Our money couldn't keep up. And so it left us in this highly asymmetric situation wherein money is dependent on a central authority for it to work. And so economic activity is becoming more and more dispersed and more global, and being conducted at a much vaster scale across the world. But it is it is reliant on a form of money that ultimately relies on trusted third parties and central points of failure. And the bigger the economic activity, the more lucrative their failure, and the more lucrative the failure, the bigger this was as a problem. So I think this just it really is that we didn't have Bitcoin. We didn't have a form of money that we could have resist this kind of takeover, and that's really what Bitcoin does. So because of that, it just created this massive asymmetry in the power that the people who control the money have over the rest of society. And it made banking and central banking the most lucrative business, and it made government an enormously lucrative business. And it came at the expense of the productive sectors of society. And so these grew into essentially parasitic functions on society. Yep. And the way that they became parasitic on society was by destroying society's ability to save. And it's just, it's been devastating. It's taken a massive toll. Yeah. But again, I continue to be optimistic about it. And I describe it in I make the case for this in the book, that ultimately I'm optimistic that capitalist civilization wins, because capitalist civilization is not, it's not a team. It's not blue team versus red team. It's not two soccer teams on a pitch playing by the same rules. It's a fundamentally different mechanism of organizing society, and those who are able to command a capitalist system, those who are able to behave with one another in a civilized way, those who are able to accept property rights, and that's really the key concept here. If you're able to accept the property rights of others, if you're able to not take other people's stuff, you will be a lot richer in the long term, because you will live in a situation in a society where people have the incentive to accumulate capital. They have the incentive to be productive. They have the incentive to cooperate. And that's going to be far more powerful than people who don't. And so in my mind, things are not looking very bright if you're looking at the US. If you're in the US, you can see there's a palpable frustration with most people. They see that things are wrong. Things are getting worse. And I think in a lot of places in Europe, that is the case. And there is the temptation to think of this as, having been the forefront of human civilization for so long, that if this place falls apart, then the rest of the world falls apart. But I think maybe, I don't have a crystal ball, but even if things get really bad there, ultimately places where people respect property, places where people are able to maintain civilization, are going to have such an enormous advantage over places that don't. So whether it is in the West or in other places, or in some parts of the West or in other parts of the West, or in El Salvador, whichever society is able to organize itself in a way in which it respects property right, in which it respects capital accumulation, it's just going to be on another level of civilization from the others. And it's going to be really, it's like tanks versus arrows. And I think that's ultimately why I think I'm optimistic, in spite of all of the many ways in which the book explains that things are going wrong and can go wrong.
Oh, I'm optimistic too. It's interesting what you just said, and some of the aspects of your book make me think of the sovereign individual and the thesis about how the nation state is in the process of disintegrating, and it will be the most kind of fought. There's going to be a lot of opposition, and it's going to be most painful probably in the West, in the US, with the global reserve currency and all of that. But there is so much opportunity in that. So I'm kind of curious, what do you see as the ideal role of government if we are on the Bitcoin standard? Is there a place for some type of government in order to protect your property rights, to enforce laws so that people don't commit crimes against one another? Do you see it as very, very small, obviously, compared to what we have now?
I think, so this is the chapter 16 and 17 in the book that I discuss defense, violence, and how basically society organizes itself against defense. And the common mainstream view on this issue is that, capitalism is all fun and games. It helps us have cheap Doritos and 17 different flavors of soap or whatever. But for the serious stuff, you need politics, and politics is all about power. And that's nonsense, because defense from violence is just another market good. And even though governments pretend that they have a monopoly on defense and a monopoly on protection from violence, the reality is it's a free market at every level. It's predominantly a free market. So in the book, I make the case there are likely twice as many private policemen in the world than there are government policemen. And so anybody who's got a bank, anybody who's got a jewelry store, anybody who's got any kind of serious valuables, they're not relying on police for their protection. And of course, that's not even a slight to the police. But why should I, as a taxpayer, pay for you and your bank to have protection? Why shouldn't you and your bank hire your own security? I think it's a much more it's just the natural way in which things would work much better, because that's capitalist calculation. And I discussed this in the book in chapter 12, the market economy. The market economy is the situation where people have private property, and so they're able to make economic calculation. That's maybe the most important concept in the book and in Austrian economics, which is maybe the most important concept in terms of how few people understand it and how few people hear about it. That we can't have economic production if we don't have economic calculation. In order to have economic calculation, in order for us to be able to think about the different alternatives and the opportunity costs, you need to have private property. You need to have the owners of property make calculation. And that's why private security is what secures most people. You buy your own gun, or you hire your own private police or private security guards. And that's what does things. So I think in reality, we're heading more and more, we're seeing this more and more, and we're seeing the truth of the fact that the vast majority of the world is running, the vast majority of the world has a free market in protection, and in free market protection from violence. And also, I bring in the example of weapons manufacture. The vast majority of weapon manufacturers are also private companies, and they also operate on the market. So it's really just another good like every other. Now, whether we are going toward a fully anarchist world or not is, again, I don't have a crystal ball, but I think so I don't have strong opinions on this. But I think the key concept is ultimately that if you're going to have a civilized society, if you're going to have an order in which people are able to live in a civilized way, if you're going to have a world, the thing that's going to triumph, the thing that's going to allow more capital accumulation, more civilized behavior, more productive activity, is going to necessarily be the kind of economic system that allows people more freedom to make their own decisions. And so for me, that's going to mean less and less government. But even if we do have some form of government, I think that the key and most important concept, which Ludwig von Mises refers to, is the concept of self-determination. So Mises, if you read a lot of his articles and a lot of his talk, he's not an anarchist in a sense that he recognizes there's an important role for the government to play in this thing and that and the other thing. And he explains many ways in which government wants to play his role. And so a lot of people say, well, he was a statist. And a lot of people say, anarchists are unreasonable. Even Mises believed in those things. But the key concept is self-determination and the right to secession. The idea that, you can be part of a government and the government can have its rules and it can impose rules on you. But if you don't like it, you can opt out. And I think this is perhaps where the world would go if we break the fiat printers and if we run on a Bitcoin standard. And governments, if we get rid of this cancer that is a government with a central bank that controls money and has the ability to just rob everybody by printing the money to finance itself, if you get rid of this insane cancer that has ruined humanity for the past couple of 100 years and go back to a world in which the money is not a technology for stealing from people, but a technology that people use, well, then the way that government survives and the way that society thrives and the way that the way that government is going to be selected for is its ability to attract people willingly rather than force them, because you can't just print money. So you want people to willingly pay you taxes. You want people to willingly stay with you. You want people not to be able to move. And so, of course, with the digital world, the ability of money and capital to move becomes a lot easier. But I think, and here I mentioned the work of Prince Hans Adam of Liechtenstein, which I mentioned in the book.
Yes.
So he's actually a really interesting intellectual, as well as being a prince of a principality in the center of Europe. And he's written an excellent book called The State in the Third Millennium. And in it, he envisions that the way that the state is going to evolve as the world heads towards more freedom, more self-determination, as people have more wealth, more education, and expect to be able to make more decisions for themselves. He offers something that's a little bit different from the way in which people view liberation and political freedom. So the kind of standard textbook model of liberalism and political freedom in the West and most of the world today is the idea that, you have elections, and every 4 years you get to choose a new sociopath who gets to rob you for 4 years. And then if you don't like the way he robs you, well, just find another crazy sociopath who's going to take control of the money printer and rob you. And what he's saying is, no, effectively he's saying, no, let's look at how the market actually works. So, you get an iPhone or you get a laptop, you don't get that by being involved in micromanaging how Apple works. You don't vote in elections for Apple. Buying an iPhone does not give you a right to vote on what Tim Cook needs to do next year and how they're going to make the iPhone. You have absolutely no choice with anything that Apple does, except that one choice, which is you buy their stuff or you don't.
Yep.
That's it. And so if you apply that to the concept of government, I think that's a much more healthy way of operating governance, in the sense that as an individual, you have the choice to opt into a political form of organization or opt out. And so in that case, you're not involved in the day-to-day management, or you have less and less involvement in the day-to-day management of how the country is run. But you get the choice of opting out and seceding down to the local level. So in the case of Liechtenstein, every single hamlet in Liechtenstein, every single tiny little village in Liechtenstein, or even neighborhood, can choose to secede at any point in time. And the right to secede is protected. So they can become their own country, or they can join Switzerland, or they can join Austria if they want to. And effectively, the most recent political reform that Liechtenstein had, that was, I think, in 2004 or 2005, actually involved the prince taking on more executive power at the expense of the parliament. which is the opposite of how the whole world is going. The whole world is going towards devolving power into the hands of parliament and away from the hands of the executive. So distributing power more and more and making it more distributed, which is similar to, in the case of Apple, getting rid of Tim Cook or making Tim Cook the kind of ceremonial leader of the company, and having, committees of, say, California Apple users and New York Apple users and French Apple users setting their own policies and trying to arrive at ways of how to produce iPhones. And you can imagine how dysfunctional that would be if they were trying to do it. The only way that Apple works is that you have a CEO, and the CEO has full executive power. And that's kind of the model in Liechtenstein, in the sense that there's more power in the hand of the prince, but people have the freedom to opt out. Perhaps that's going to be the way in which government evolves. I think people might want to consider this. And I think another reason why we might want to consider this in the case of a Bitcoin world is that royal families have basically, royal families don't make a lot of sense for most people who live in democracies, because, why would you want somebody to decide for you? Why would you want to be ruled by somebody else? Which, you still buy an iPhone, even though Tim Cook is the king of Apple, and there's no democracy in Apple, and nobody asks you for your opinion, but you still buy the iPhone. And I think the royal families make more sense once you understand them as multi-generational low time preference mechanisms for running government. And so because they've been around for hundreds of years, they know something about how this business is run, and they have a vested interest in running it for the long term. And the way that they run it best for the long term is by not being despots, by not massively exploiting and destroying the lives of the people under their command. And that's why, if you look at the worst despots of history, if you look at the most murderous and most despotic and tyrannic regimes, they're usually democratically elected. They are not monarchs. So,
really?
Yeah.
It's so interesting.
Mao, Stalin, Hitler.
Yeah.
None of those people came from a royal family. They all won elections. They were all democratic. But they were all high time preference trash, because they were all did not come from royal families that wanted to care, that had been given this job from 10 generations and were entrusted it with running the country for 10 generations later. If you look at all over the world, you look at rates of inflation, you see that monarchies have a lot lower inflation than republics. In specific regions or all over the world, you see this trend is very clear. Monarchies just generally are more forward-looking and more low-time preference, because as a king, you're not just in power for 4 years. When you're in power for 4 years and when your power is uncertain, you need to take as much as you can for as quickly as you can, because you never know when you are going to be out of power. Whereas if you expect that your great grandkids are going to be in power after you, you don't want to impoverish the people now. You want to keep the people rich. You want to fatten them up effectively so that your grandkids can continue to milk them. And so there's an excellent coincidence of interests here. You want your grandkids to be healthy, wealthy, and happy. And the king also wants your grandkids to be healthy, wealthy, and happy. Whereas in a republic, in a democratic system, you want your grandkids to be healthy and happy. Your president is only in power for the next somewhere between 1 and 10 years, 15 years, 20 years. He doesn't give a shit about your grandkids. He wants to milk you for as much as he can, as quickly as he can right now. So perhaps I think this is kind of, one of the more controversial things that I argue in the book. I think a more free world might bring us back to a system of monarchy with the right to self-secession and self-determination and secession. And just one last kind of evidence for this, that's, if there are still any pro-democracy Bitcoiners listening, this is going to trigger them. This is going to be the final trigger for them. Is it's no coincidence that the century of fiat was the century of democracy and the century of removing kings all over the world. So fiat came into the world primarily in the early 20th century. That's when a lot of the kingdoms of the world were removed and replaced by democracies. I don't think that's a coincidence. And we're going to see, if we're going to reverse that, how that's going to play out. And my hunch is that it's going to work out a lot better for people who have royal families, because the royal families are going to be much more a low time preference. They're going to be able to stack sats. They're going to take care of their citizens or subjects much better than democracies that are going to be much more high time preference and are not going to see the point in stacking sats. Perhaps, who knows?
That's really interesting. I mean, obviously our political system is so broken here because everything is about getting reelected and reelected. And all of a sudden you zoom out and all these people have been in office, 4 decades, and they've overseen the erosion of society and society's wealth. And meanwhile, they've got massive houses and they've been trading better than the average, stock fund portfolio managers. But
here's the thing: they managed to stay in office for 40 years. Like if you look at these plutocrats, the American oligarchs like Pelosi or Feinstein or these people, and obviously when they're Russian or when they're in third world countries, they call them oligarchs and plutocrats. But in the US, they're just democratic leaders. But the key thing, the distinction between those people and monarchs, is that at every point in those 40 years, they had a very high level of uncertainty about their ability to continue. So Nancy Pelosi 40 years ago did not know that she was going to be in power for 40 years. She had a lot less certainty about her job in that than a king who was in power 40 years ago and has been in power for 40 years. And she can't just hand over the job to her kids, although who knows, the way things are going in the US. But even if she can, even if she will, I don't know if she has kids, but even if she does, and she does that, again, it's far more uncertain. It's not like a monarchy where everybody is accepting the idea that, you're the queen and your son is going to be the king and his son is going to be the king or whatever. So that's, you get to the, democracy just, you're still getting royalty, essentially, but instead of getting good royalty with a low time preference, you're getting high time preference trash.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Well, a lot of people would agree with that. And something else I agree with that you mentioned earlier is this idea of people will vote with their feet more. And I think people are. Even during the pandemic, you saw an exodus from states like California that were more closed to places like Florida that were more open. And people voted essentially with where they were going to have their businesses and where they were going to live their lives and where they would be taxed less. And I think zooming out, we'll see that more around the world, because as you mentioned, the idea of self-determination, people will always pursue where there is opportunity and where they can hopefully create a better life. A lot of people came to the US for that. I cannot believe, Saifedean, how much things have changed since my family immigrated, because my mom and dad came in the early 90s with this idea that, we grew up under communism. America's the land of opportunity and freedom, and everything will be so much better if we just work really hard here and our kids get an education. And they find that their peers that stayed back in Poland actually are living a better life and a more comfortable retirement than them in America, when they've worked so hard for all these decades, because everything is shifted. And yet we still see so many people wanting to come here and coming to the border and wanting to access what this country offers. And I think that around the world, there's going to be a lot of shifts. People who were born in one country are going to end up in another. And it's going to be an interesting, I think, several decades as we witness the collapse of some of these regimes that have been so powerful. So thank you so much for taking the time. I know we're probably running out of time. 2 other areas I really wanted to cover, but we probably don't have time, is you talked a lot about power, and there are so many misconceptions about energy and power. The fact that we have more energy beaming at us from the sun that we could consume, the entire race consumes in a year. We just haven't figured out a way to actually harness it in a way that makes economical sense, but hopefully in the future, maybe we will. So it's not a question of energy being scarce, because it's actually very, very very abundant. We just haven't been able to capture it. And also you had you had maybe a chapter or so on intellectual property that I found fascinating. I hadn't heard that argument before. And we see so many patents being filed. And I used to assume that that's a good thing. You know, it spurs innovation, but you sort of posit that it's actually the opposite. So maybe I'll tease people to the book for that information, unless you want to share anything about either of those two points in your book.
I mean, I'm gonna join you and just tease people because they're not short arguments. I'd need to take a very deep breath and get into them in depth. And I think maybe we'll do some other episodes maybe.
Okay,
if you'll have me on again.
I love reading your work. I try to absorb as much of the knowledge, the brain power that you're so generous with. And thank you so much, because really anytime I meet other people too in the space, your book changed their whole perspective and inspired them or led them to change their lives, get into Bitcoin, lower their time preference, think about the future. So your contribution has been so immense. I hope you succeed with that, with book, promoting your book, and I hope everyone reads it. Share this interview, whether it's on audio or video, and I'm going to pick someone from Twitter and I will send them Principles of Economics. Unfortunately, you're not going to get my signed copy. I'm keeping that for myself because I want Saif's autograph. But I'll send you the book, and hopefully you'll enjoy the conversation. So Saif, thank you so much. Where do you want to point people?
My website, Saifedean.com, where you can find all my books and take my courses, my online courses. There's the courses on which this book was based. And then starting in September, I'm going to be offering a new course based on this book. So, you know, I did the courses and wrote the book, and now I'm going to make another course that's updated. And that's basically the process of how I create those things. It starts off with an idea, and then you make a course, then you make a book, then you make another course. Yeah. So there's going to be another course starting in September. And you can also find the book on Amazon and many other booksellers worldwide. And you can listen to my podcast, the Bitcoin Standard podcast, and also on Twitter. I'm pretty active on Twitter, as always. We have a lot of fun on Twitter. So come say hi.
Well, I love it. And it's so cool that now you can be anywhere in the world and have Saifedean as your teacher, which I think is so incredible about technology. So Saif, thank you so much.
Thank you, Natalie. Thank you. I really appreciate it. Thanks for having me.